Winter of 1868. The mining settlement of Cold Ridge, nestled in the Colorado Rockies at 9,200 feet elevation, where temperatures plunged to 30 below zero and stayed there for weeks. The town's most respected master builder, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Strauss, stood before the settlement council and declared, "That tower Nathaniel Crowley is building against Blackstone Ridge, it's a death trap. The weight will crack the mountain face. The moisture will rot the foundation. And when, not if, it collapses, it'll take half the slope with it." But today, you're going to understand why the worst idea became the most copied design in 3 counties. What did this stubborn Scottish stonemason understand about thermodynamics that the experts completely missed? If you want to discover a real survival technique every week, methods that actually worked when people's lives depended on them, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay until the end, because the numbers from that first winter silenced an entire town. Nathaniel Crowley arrived in Cold Ridge in the fall of 1867 with his wife Margaret and 3 children under the age of 8. He'd worked stone in the Scottish Highlands for 20 years before crossing the Atlantic, and he knew cold. But the Colorado Rockies taught him a new kind of suffering. The standard building method in Cold Ridge was simple. Log cabins, 12 by 16 feet, single room, stone fireplace on one wall. Every family built the same way. The settlement had 43 cabins by late 1867, and every single one of them burned through 12 to 15 cords of wood per winter. The problem wasn't the fireplaces. The problem was physics. Mountain winds at that elevation didn't just blow, they scoured. They found every gap, every seam, every poorly chinked log joint. The cold didn't seep in. It poured in. Families would wake to ice on the inside of their walls. Children slept 3 to a bed, layered in every piece of clothing they owned. And the wood consumption was brutal. Men spent half their waking hours cutting, hauling, splitting, and stacking timber just to keep their families from freezing. Nathaniel watched his neighbors for 2 months. He measured wind patterns. He studied how the settlement sat in a natural bowl where cold air pooled and stagnated. He noticed how Blackstone Ridge, a granite outcrop rising 120 feet above the valley floor, blocked the western wind, but also absorbed sunlight for 8 hours every clear day. He also noticed something else. The standard log cabins leaked heat in every direction, through the roof, through the gaps, through the floor. But worse, they fought against the environment instead of working with it. Every cabin was positioned the same way, regardless of wind exposure or sun angle. Every chimney was built identically, regardless of draft problems or backdraft during storms. It was construction by tradition, not by observation. Margaret saw her husband standing outside in the freezing November mornings, notebook in hand, sketching angles and measuring shadows. She asked him once what he was planning. He told her, "I'm not building what everyone expects. I'm building what the mountain is offering us." The concept was radical. Instead of fighting the ridge, he would partner with it. The granite absorbed solar heat during the day, heat that would otherwise be wasted. If he built into the mountain rather than away from it, that stored thermal energy could work for him instead of dissipating into empty air. The stone would become a battery. The tower would become a chimney. And the vertical design would let hot air rise naturally, heating every level as it ascended. And he made a decision that would get him branded as either a genius or a lunatic. He would build a stone tower, not beside the mountain, against it, into it, a structure 65 feet tall, with the mountain itself forming the back wall. Multiple levels connected by internal stone staircases, a massive firebox at the base, and at the top, 20 feet above the ridgeline, a domed chamber that would serve as both living quarters and an access point to the mountain summit. When he presented sketches to the Settlement Council in November 1867, the room went silent. Wilhelm Strauss, who had built 17 of the town's cabins, stood up and said flatly, "You'll kill your family, Nathaniel. That's not a home. That's a monument to stubbornness." Others murmured agreement. One man pointed out that nobody in the Rockies built towers. There was a reason log cabins were standard. Another questioned whether Nathaniel even understood how stone behaved in freeze-thaw cycles. A third suggested, not unkindly, that maybe the Scottish Highlands had made him too confident in methods that wouldn't translate to Colorado's altitude and conditions. But Crowley had done the mathematics. He'd calculated thermal mass, heat retention, convective flow, and radiant transfer. He knew exactly what he was building. The question was whether anyone else would live long enough to see him proven right. Nathaniel began construction in early December 1867, racing against the deep cold. The design was unlike anything Coleridge had ever seen. The foundation started 15 feet into the mountain slope, anchored directly into granite bedrock. The tower itself rose in a tapering cylinder, 8 feet diameter at the base, widening to 12 feet at the third level, then tapering again before the dome. Total height, 65 feet. The mountain face formed the entire western wall, which meant 1/4 of the structure required no masonry at all. But here's what made engineers nervous. Nathaniel was betting everything on thermal mass and convective circulation. At ground level, he built a firebox using sandstone blocks, each weighing between 40 and 80 pounds, set with clay mortar mixed with lime and sand. The firebox wasn't just big. It was massive, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, with a throat that fed into a vertical flue running up the center of the entire tower like spine. Here's the concept. Cold air enters low. Fire heats it. Hot air rises through the flue. As it ascends 65 feet, it radiates heat outward through the stone walls at every level. The stone absorbs that heat and releases it slowly, radiant warmth that doesn't disappear the moment the fire dies. Each level was a separate living space. First floor, kitchen and common area, stone floor, 8-foot ceiling. Second floor, sleeping quarters for the children, accessible by an internal stone staircase carved into the mountainside. Third floor, Nathaniel and Margaret's room, with narrow slit windows facing east to catch morning sun. Fourth floor, storage for preserved food, tools, and winter supplies. The genius wasn't just in the vertical arrangement. It was in how Nathaniel positioned each element for maximum thermal efficiency. The kitchen on the first floor meant cooking heat contributed directly to the base temperature. The children's sleeping quarters on the second floor captured the first wave of rising warmth. Not too hot, not too cold. The third floor, where adults slept, received the concentrated heat from below plus radiant warmth from the mountain wall. And the fourth floor storage area benefited from being the warmest, driest space in the entire structure, perfect for preserving food without freezing or spoilage. He also engineered ventilation in a way nobody expected. Small vent holes near the base of each level allowed fresh air to enter, while the central flue created negative pressure that drew stale air upward and out. It was passive climate control. No pumps, no fans, just physics. Temperature differential creating constant, gentle air circulation that prevented the buildup of smoke, moisture, or carbon dioxide. The stone walls themselves were another calculated decision. Nathaniel didn't use uniform blocks. He alternated dense granite, high thermal mass, slow to heat but slow to cool, with lighter sandstone, faster thermal response. This created layers of heat storage operating at different rates. Some releasing warmth quickly when the fire died down, others holding reserve heat for hours afterward. It was like building a battery with multiple cells, each contributing to a longer overall discharge. And at the top, the dome, 12 feet in diameter, topped with a wooden frame roof covered in split cedar shingles. This wasn't decorative. The dome housed a sleeping loft, an observation platform, and a reinforced wooden door that opened directly onto the mountain summit via a stone staircase Nathaniel carved into the ridge itself. 2 access points. Ground level for daily use. Summit access for emergencies, signaling, or simply escaping if the valley became impassable. The wood details were minimal but critical. Roof beams in the dome, railings on the interior stairs, shutters for the windows, and a reinforced plank door at the base. Everything else? Stone. But Wilhelm Strauss saw only disaster. He told the town council in January 1868. The moisture from the mountain will seep into the mortar and freeze. The expansion will crack every joint. The weight. Do you understand the weight? For 1,000 cubic feet of stone pressing against the slope. It's going to shear off. And the fire risk? One spark up that central flue and the whole structure becomes a chimney of death. The town doctor added his concern. Smoke inhalation. Poor ventilation. You're building a stone coffin, Nathaniel. There were practical objections, too. How would he get furniture up those narrow stone stairs? What if someone got injured on the upper levels? How would you carry them down? What about the children? One slip on those stairs, and they'd fall 20 feet on a stone. And the cost and labor. Nathaniel had spent 4 months doing nothing but cutting, hauling, and laying stone. 4 months of work that could have been spent hunting, trapping, or preparing for winter in more conventional ways. And the social judgment was even harsher. Men at the general store muttered that Crowley was afraid of real winter, that he was hiding behind stone instead of facing the cold like a man, that the tower looked less like a home and more like a fortress, something a person builds when they don't trust their own strength. Margaret Crowley heard the whispers. So did the children. But Nathaniel kept building. By March 1868, the tower stood complete. Smoke rose from the flue. The family moved in. And then they waited for winter to return. The criticism didn't stay quiet. It went public. In August 1868, Wilhelm Strauss wrote a letter to the territorial governor's mining safety office, arguing that Crowley's tower posed a structural risk to the entire settlement. He claimed that if the tower collapsed during a snowstorm, the resulting avalanche of stone and debris could destroy cabins downslope and block the only road out of the valley. The letter was read aloud at a town meeting. Nathaniel was present. Strauss stood and addressed him directly. You've built a beautiful grave, Nathaniel. I'll give you that. But when the frost heaves that foundation and the whole thing comes down, don't expect the rest of us to dig you out. A mill operator named Josiah Kern added, It's not just dangerous. It's wasteful. You've used enough stone to build 3 proper cabins. You've carved stairs into a mountain that didn't need carving. And for what? So you can pretend you're smarter than the rest of us. A younger builder, fresh from Pennsylvania, stood and pointed out that stone towers were for rich landowners in Europe, not for working men in mining camps. He said Nathaniel was importing old-world arrogance into a place that required new-world practicality. We're not building cathedrals here, he said. We're surviving. And survival doesn't need to be 65 feet tall. The criticism escalated when a minister visiting from Denver spent a night in Coldridge and mentioned the tower in his Sunday sermon. He didn't name Nathaniel directly, but everyone knew who he meant when he spoke about pride disguised as preparation and men who build monuments to themselves while calling it shelter for their families. The sermon was published in a regional newspaper. Word spread. By September, Nathaniel's reputation had shifted from eccentric to reckless. Families stopped hiring him for stonework. When he offered to help repair a collapsed root cellar, the owner declined. Margaret noticed that women at the general store would finish their purchases quickly and leave when she entered. The children came home, saying other kids had been told not to play near the tower because it might fall. The town's senior woman, a widow named Abigail Foss who'd survived 2 decades of frontier winters, put it more bluntly. That's not a house, Mr. Crowley. That's vanity. A real man doesn't need a tower to prove he can survive. He survives because he works, not because he hides. Even families who had been friendly to the Crowleys grew distant. Children stopped playing with Nathaniel's kids. Margaret was excluded from quilting circles. The message was clear. You don't defy the community's way of doing things and expect to remain part of the community. Nathaniel didn't argue. He didn't defend himself at the meetings. He simply said, We'll see what winter brings. But privately, Margaret asked him if they'd made a mistake. Not about the design, she trusted his knowledge, but about staying in Coldridge at all. Maybe they should move to a larger town where people wouldn't care how you built your house, where success mattered more than conformity. Nathaniel told her, If I'm wrong, we leave in the spring. But if I'm right, we stay. And if we stay, this place learns something. And winter, when it came, brought something nobody expected. November 1868 started cold and stayed cold. By early December, Daytime temperatures weren't climbing above zero. By mid-December, the settlement recorded 18 straight days below -20 Fahrenheit. Then the blizzard hit. It started on December 19th and didn't stop for 6 days. Winds gusted to 60 miles per hour. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Drifts buried cabin doors. Families were trapped inside, burning wood as fast as they could split it, trying to keep their fires alive. But here's the problem. When you're burning wood that fast, you run out. And when you run out, you start burning furniture. Then floorboards. Then anything that will catch flame. By Christmas Eve, half the settlement was in crisis. Fires were dying because there was no dry wood left. The wood they'd stacked outside was buried under 4 feet of snow and frozen solid. Even if you could dig it out, it wouldn't burn. It was too wet, too cold. Families huddled together in single rooms, wearing every layer they owned, watching their breath frost in the air, even with a fire going. Internal temperatures in the log cabins dropped to 40 degrees. Then 35. Children were getting frostbite while sitting indoors. Wilhelm Strauss tried everything he knew. He stuffed rags into every gap in his cabin walls. He kept his fire roaring day and night, burning through 2 cords of precious dry wood in 3 days. His family slept in shifts, someone always awake to feed the fire, because letting it die even for an hour meant waking to ice on the windows and floors cold enough to freeze water in a cup. Other families weren't as prepared. Josiah Kern's wife wrapped their youngest daughter in every blanket they owned and still couldn't stop her shivering. The doctor made house calls and found families burning furniture, old shoes, even leather harnesses, anything combustible. He warned that if the cold didn't break soon, they'd start seeing serious cases of frostbite, hypothermia, maybe worse. The settlement's communal woodpile, meant as an emergency reserve, was nearly exhausted by December 27th. Men were making dangerous trips into the forest, trudging through waist-deep snow to reach standing deadwood, hauling back frozen logs that took an hour to split and another hour to dry enough to catch flame. It was unsustainable. People were burning more calories staying warm than they could replace with food. On the morning of December 26th, Wilhelm Strauss made the decision to send 2 men on snowshoes to the nearest town, 15 miles south, to request emergency supplies and firewood. It was a dangerous journey, but people were starting to talk about frostbite turning to gangrene, about losing fingers and toes. And then someone looked up at Blackstone Ridge. Smoke was rising from Nathaniel Crowley's tower. Steady, controlled, not the frantic, thick smoke of a family burning everything they own. Calm smoke, the smoke of a fire that's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Josiah Kern was the first to make the trek up the slope. He knocked on the stone door at the base of the tower, half expecting to find a family barely surviving. Nathaniel opened the door in his shirt sleeves. The temperature inside was 73 degrees Fahrenheit. Stay with me, because what happened next humiliated the correct method and changed how people built in these mountains for the next 40 years. Josiah Kern stood in the doorway of Nathaniel Crowley's tower, his breath visible in the outside air, but not inside. The contrast was so stark it took his mind a moment to process what his body already knew. This space was warm. Not huddled by the fire warm. Not tolerable if you don't move warm. Actually, genuinely warm. 73 degrees Fahrenheit. In the middle of the worst blizzard Coldridge had seen in a decade. Nathaniel gestured for him to come in. Close the door. You're letting the cold in. Josiah stepped inside, and the heavy stone door swung shut behind him. The temperature difference was immediate and undeniable. His ears stopped aching. His fingers, which had been going numb during the climb up the slope, began to tingle as circulation returned. He looked around the first-floor room, the kitchen and common area, and saw Margaret Crowley kneading bread dough at a wooden table. The children were playing on the stone floor in their normal clothes. No layers. No blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Just regular clothing. Ow! Josiah asked. Nathaniel pointed to the firebox. I fed it this morning at dawn. Haven't touched it since. Josiah stared. It was now past noon. 6 hours. The fire was still burning, slow, steady, efficient, but it wasn't roaring. It wasn't consuming wood at the frantic pace every other family in Coldridge was experiencing. The logs in the firebox were thick and burning gradually, releasing heat in a controlled way that seemed almost impossible given the temperature outside. "What's the secret?" Josiah asked. "There's no secret," Nathaniel said. "It's just physics. Come, I'll show you." Nathaniel led him to the firebox and explained what Josiah was seeing. The sandstone blocks surrounding the fire weren't just structural, they were thermal batteries. Each block weighed between 40 and 80 pounds. When the fire burned, the stones absorbed heat. Not surface heat, deep heat, the kind that takes hours to penetrate and even longer to dissipate. "Feel the wall," Nathaniel said. Josiah placed his palm against the stone wall 3 feet from the firebox. It was warm, not hot enough to burn, but warm enough that he could feel it through his glove. He moved his hand further from the fire, 5 feet, then 8 feet. Still warm. The entire first floor was radiating heat from the walls themselves. But the real genius became clear when Nathaniel walked him up the internal stone staircase to the second floor. The children's sleeping quarters. The temperature here was slightly cooler than the first floor, around 68 degrees, but still far warmer than any log cabin in the valley. Nathaniel explained the convection principle. Hot air rises. The central flue acted like a spine, channeling heat upward through the entire structure. As the heated air rose, it warmed each level progressively, and the stone walls at each level absorbed and radiated that warmth outward. Third floor, Nathaniel and Margaret's room. 70 degrees. The narrow slit windows were closed with wooden shutters, but even with them open during the day, the room maintained its temperature because the mountain face, forming the entire western wall, acted as an additional thermal mass. The granite absorbed solar heat during the brief hours of winter sunlight and released it slowly throughout the night. Fourth floor, storage. 72 degrees. The warmest level in the tower because heat naturally accumulated at the top. But unlike a standard cabin where heat escapes through the roof, here the stone dome captured and held it. Nathaniel showed Josiah the ventilation holes, small openings near the base of the dome that allowed just enough air exchange to prevent stuffiness while the central flue drew moisture and stale air upward and out. "The mountain is doing half the work," Nathaniel explained. "During the day, the sun heats the granite. At night, that heat radiates inward. The tower captures it, the stone walls store it, and the vertical design distributes it evenly through natural convection. I'm not fighting the environment. I'm partnering with it." Josiah did the math in his head. Nathaniel had burned maybe 1/3 the wood that Josiah's family had consumed in the same period. Maybe less. And the temperature inside the tower was 30 to 40 degrees warmer than inside Josiah's cabin, even with his fire roaring constantly. Then Nathaniel showed him something else. He opened a wooden hatch in the floor of the 4th level, revealing a small storage chamber built into the mountain face itself. Inside were stacks of firewood, split, dried, and ready to burn. "I cut this in September," Nathaniel said. "Stored it here where it stays dry and actually warms up slightly from the surrounding stone. When I need wood, I'm not pulling frozen, wet logs from snowdrift. I'm pulling pre-warmed, bone-dry fuel that catches immediately and burns clean." Josiah climbed the final ladder to the dome, the observation platform and sleeping loft. From here, through the narrow windows, he could see the entire valley below. Smoke rising from every cabin, thick, desperate smoke. And then he looked at the tower's flue. Thin, clean smoke. Efficient combustion. The numbers were undeniable. Nathaniel's family was using roughly 40% of the wood their neighbors were burning. They were maintaining internal temperatures 25 to 35 degrees warmer. And they had enough stored fuel to last another month without cutting a single additional log. When Josiah descended back to the first floor, Margaret offered him hot tea. He accepted, still trying to process what he'd seen. The fire in the firebox had barely diminished. The room was still 73 degrees. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage. "You need to tell Wilhelm," Josiah said quietly. Nathaniel shook his head. "Wilhelm knows where I live. If he wants to see, the door is open." But Josiah knew what this meant. Every family in Coldridge was suffering. Children were at risk. People were burning through their winter reserves at an unsustainable rate. And here, 65 feet above the valley floor, a Scottish stonemason had solved a problem that the town's most respected builder had declared unsolvable. Josiah left the tower as the sun was setting. The temperature outside had dropped to 28 below zero. He made his way back down the slope, his mind racing. When he reached his own cabin, the interior temperature was 37 degrees, despite a fire that had been fed constantly all day. His wife looked at him, desperate for good news about the supply run to the neighboring town. Instead, he told her about the tower, about the 73 degrees, about the 6-hour fire, about the 40% wood consumption. She didn't believe him at first. Nobody would, but the numbers didn't lie. And by the next morning, when the blizzard finally began to ease, word had spread through the settlement like wildfire. Nathaniel Crowley's death trap had just become the warmest refuge in 3 counties. December 28, 1868. The blizzard had moved east, leaving Coldridge buried under nearly 5 feet of snow. The sky was clear for the first time in a week, and the morning temperature was minus 18 Fahrenheit. Families emerged from their cabins to assess the damage. Collapsed roofs under snow weight, depleted wood stores, frostbitten fingers and toes, and a town-wide fuel crisis that wouldn't be solved until spring. But something else happened that morning. Something nobody expected. Wilhelm Strauss climbed the slope to Nathaniel Crowley's tower. He didn't announce his visit. He simply appeared at the stone door and knocked. Nathaniel opened it, saw who was standing there, and stepped aside without a word. Wilhelm entered. The door closed behind him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Wilhelm stood in the first-floor common room, feeling the warmth, seeing the efficient fire, watching the Crowley children playing comfortably in their regular clothes. His eyes moved to the stone walls, to the central flue, to the staircase carved into the mountain face. He was reading the structure the way a master builder reads a plan, analyzing load distribution, thermodynamics, structural integrity. Finally, he spoke. "I was wrong." Nathaniel said nothing. "I told you this was dangerous. I told the council it would collapse. I wrote a letter to the territorial office saying you were putting the entire settlement at risk." Wilhelm's voice was quiet but clear. "I was wrong about all of it." "You were worried about your town," Nathaniel said. "That's not wrong." "No," Wilhelm said firmly. "I was arrogant. I assumed that because I'd built 17 cabins, I understood building. But you understood something deeper. You understood heat. You understood stone. You understood how to work with the mountain instead of against it." He paused, looking around the room again. "This isn't just a house. This is engineering. Real engineering." And I missed it completely. Margaret appeared from the kitchen area with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Wilhelm without comment. He accepted it, wrapping his cold hands around the warm ceramic. "I need to learn this," Wilhelm said. "My family is suffering. My cabin barely holds 40 degrees, even with a fire burning day and night. My children are cold. My wife is cold, and I'm burning wood so fast we'll be out by February." He looked directly at Nathaniel. "Will you teach me? Not just me. Anyone who wants to learn. Will you show us what you've done here?" Nathaniel considered the question. He could have refused. He could have let the town suffer a little longer, let the humiliation sink in deeper. But that wasn't who he was. He'd built the tower to protect his family, not to prove a point. If others could benefit, why wouldn't he share? "I'll teach anyone who asks," Nathaniel said. "But understand, this isn't a quick fix. Building with stone takes time. It takes planning. It takes understanding how heat moves and how mass stores energy. It's not harder than building a log cabin, but it's different. People need to be willing to learn." Wilhelm nodded. "They will be. After this week, they'll be willing." And he was right. By early January, Nathaniel had visitors nearly every day. Families trudging up the slope, asking to see the tower, asking questions about firebox dimensions, stone selection, mortar composition, flue design, and thermal mass calculations. He answered every question. He drew diagrams. He explained the physics in simple terms that anyone could understand. A trapper named Samuel Hodge was the first to adapt the design. He couldn't build a full tower. He didn't have Nathaniel's skill with stone or access to a mountain face. But he rebuilt his fireplace using the thermal mass principle. He doubled the amount of stone, positioned it to maximize radiant heat, and added a simple heat capture chamber above the firebox. His wood consumption dropped by 30% within 2 weeks. Then Josiah Kern rebuilt his chimney, incorporating a masonry heater design Nathaniel had sketched for him. Instead of letting heat escape straight up the flue, the new design forced hot gases through a series of internal channels that warmed the stone before exiting. The result: his cabin stayed warm for hours after the fire died down, and his family stopped waking up to frozen water buckets. By late February, 11 families in Coldridge had either rebuilt their heating systems or were planning to do so in the spring. The techniques varied. Not everyone could build a tower, and not everyone had access to mountain granite. But the principles were the same: maximize thermal mass, use radiant heat, design for convection, partner with the environment instead of fighting it. The town's discourse changed completely. Men who had mocked Nathaniel now asked his advice on building projects. Women who had excluded Margaret from social circles began inviting her to gatherings, asking about food storage in the tower's climate-controlled upper levels. The children, who had been ostracized, found themselves popular. Everyone wanted to see the tower, and the Crowley kids were the gatekeepers. In March 1869, Wilhelm Strauss stood before the Settlement Council and made a formal statement. He retracted his letter to the territorial office. He acknowledged that his concerns about structural stability had been unfounded. The tower had survived the worst winter on record without a single crack in the foundation. And he proposed something unprecedented: that Nathaniel Crowley be hired as the settlement's official consultant on all future construction projects involving stone or advanced heating systems. The council voted unanimously in favor. But the real validation came from the numbers. By the end of that winter, the Crowley family had consumed 2¼ cords of firewood, less than 1/5 what the average Coldridge family had burned. Their internal temperatures had remained consistently between 68 and 75 degrees throughout the coldest months, and they'd suffered 0 cases of frostbite, hypothermia, or cold-related illness. The tower had done exactly what Nathaniel designed it to do: keep his family warm, safe, and comfortable using a fraction of the resources everyone else required. And the method spread, not just through Coldridge, but through the region. By 1872, variations of the stone tower design appeared in mining camps and homesteads across the Colorado Rockies. Some built partial towers against hillsides. Others incorporated the thermal mass principles into hybrid log-and stone structures. A few ambitious builders attempted full towers, though none matched the height or integration with natural terrain that Nathaniel had achieved. In 1875, a surveyor from Denver visited Coldridge and spent 3 days studying the tower. He took measurements, made sketches, and interviewed Nathaniel at length. His report was published in a territorial engineering journal under the title Vernacular Architecture and Thermal Efficiency, a case study in adaptive design. The report concluded that Nathaniel Crowley's tower represented a practical application of thermodynamic principles that modern builders would benefit from studying. Nathaniel never sought recognition. He continued working as a stonemason, taking on projects throughout the region, teaching anyone who wanted to learn. Margaret raised their children in the tower, and later, grandchildren played on those same stone floors. The structure stood for decades, through blizzards, through summer storms, through the gradual decline and eventual abandonment of Coldridge as the mining economy shifted. But the lesson remained. Innovation doesn't always come from experts. Sometimes it comes from individuals willing to observe, to question, to calculate, and to build something different when the conventional approach fails. Nathaniel Crowley wasn't trying to revolutionize frontier architecture. He was trying to keep his family warm. But in doing so, he proved that ancient principles, thermal mass, radiant heat, natural convection, integration with landscape, weren't primitive or outdated. They were engineering, real engineering, the kind that works when conditions are brutal and resources are limited. Wilhelm Strauss said it best in the spring of 1869 standing beside Nathaniel at the base of the tower. You weren't being stubborn. You were being practical, and the rest of us were too proud to see it. The tower still stands today, partially restored, on what's now called Crowley Ridge. It's a historical landmark, though most people who visit don't fully understand what they're seeing. They see a stone tower built against a mountain. They don't see the physics. They don't see the careful calculations. They don't see the courage it took to build something radically different when everyone said it was impossible. But those who know, those who study vernacular architecture, those who understand thermodynamics, those who've spent a winter in the mountains, they see it clearly. They see a Scottish stonemason who understood that survival isn't about following rules. It's about understanding principles. And sometimes, the warmest refuge isn't the one everyone builds. It's the one nobody believed would work. So here's my question for you. Which part of this solution would you apply to your house today? Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what the coldest winter you've ever faced was. And if you want more stories like this, real survival techniques that actually worked when people's lives depended on them, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.